$190 million in bonuses in 2021. Remember, these are federal government employees, federal government bureaucrats. This isn't like, the nurses who are staffing the front lines. These are federal bureaucrats when we're talking about these bonuses.
Hey, this is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast. I'm your host, Chris Sims. I'm the Alberta director. I'm here with my partner in crime and friend, Franco Terrazzano. You're holding down the fort there in Ottawa, or I like to call it Mordor. So you were telling me the other day that they're actually looking at government pay raises, and the amount of money that we're talking about when it comes to government pay raises, like I almost choked on my coffee. How much money are we talking about here?
Well, I just have to read you the quote, okay? It's straight from the Treasury Board of Canada. The Public Service Alliance of Canada, it's a federal government union, quote, has asked for average increases, including pay and other provisions, of up to 14% annually over 3 years across their bargaining groups. Now,
what?
Chris,
I'm sorry, that's nuts.
You did hear that right. Compensation of up to 14% increase annually. Now, I almost couldn't believe that this was even within the realm of possibility of what a government union boss was pushing for. So I actually had to follow up with the government just to make sure that the quote was right. Of course, they did confirm that is what they meant, up to 14% annually increase in compensation. But you know what? It gets worse, because we found another quote from the same union. The union said that they may have, quote, no other choice but to withdraw our services and take our members on strike, end quote. So Simmer, let me break down this crazy series of events. Bureaucrats, they didn't financially suffer at all during the pandemic. They even benefited financially. Now they want more. And if taxpayers won't pony up, then they're not going to show up for work.
This is just bloody sick. As you point out many times, we are not all in this together. Okay, we're in the same storm. Yeah, some of them are in a government friggin' paid a yacht, and the rest of us are in a dinghy. This is the tale of two pandemics. They did not financially suffer during the lockdowns and the pandemics and the nonsense that happened. And now they're coming back. And like, again, I've been around collective bargaining tables. I've covered this sort of story before. 14%. So just by the numbers, if they did get a 14% raise after sailing through, what would that mean for taxpayers? How much would that cost?
Plain and simple, higher taxes. Plain and simple. Okay, so let me just break down some back of the napkin math for you. Nothing too complex, but look, the federal government spends about $60 billion a year on labor. So now giving the bureaucracy a 14% increase to the compensation would cost taxpayers about $8 billion every single year. So how would the federal government pay for that? Because $8 billion is nothing to sneeze at. Well, let me give you some examples. It could hike the GST by nearly a full percentage point, or it could hike its lowest annual income tax rate by 1.75 points. But make no mistake about it, that type of ask, that type of demand, that type of push would mean higher taxpayers for the people who just struggled over the last 2 years of the pandemic and government lockdowns. So essentially, we have people who never missed a paycheck during the lockdowns asking for a raise, and the people who have suffered financially, the mom and pop shop, the private sector worker, the private sector taxpayer over the last few years would have to pick up the tab.
And not only that, not only did they come through financially unscathed, and in some cases they got bonuses and pay raises, but we are dealing with tax hikes on this side of the fence too. So we're dealing with increased payroll taxes. We're dealing with increased alcohol taxes. We're dealing with increased carbon taxes, which, as we point out, increases the cost of everything. It doesn't matter if it's heating or eating or whatnot. I really need to stress this. Like, I live in Lethbridge, and you know it.
It's God's country.
It's not a government town. These are working people that are working on, machinery, and like they're hardworking folks. And I notice in the grocery store now, because of the inflation and the increased carbon taxes, when you see people put stuff back.
Yeah,
I see that a lot more now. And I have in the past year. I've noticed it. This is not right for them to be demanding this. Again, we need to stress. So we've got them sailing through the pandemic without financial pain, and they didn't lose their jobs. On top of that, some of them got pay raises and bonuses. On top of that, we've been paying higher taxes, including carbon tax, inflation, and whatnot. And now they want more, or they're going to go on strike. Is that what we're hearing?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Look, private sector workers were missing paychecks. Small business owners were worried that their life savings wouldn't keep the lights on over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, federal bureaucrats weren't even worried about missing their bonus checks, okay? But you're right. A lot of them did get raises. The vast majority actually got at least a raise during the pandemic. So in 2020, this union that we're talking about, the PSAC, they actually negotiated raises as private sector layoffs reached all-time highs. That's according to a story from the National Post back in 2020, when the private sector was just shedding jobs by the thousands. In fact, the federal government gave 312,000 federal employees, federal bureaucrats, at least one pay raise during the pandemic, during those lockdowns. We dug that information up through an ATIP, an access to information request. Another ATIP that we got back showed that there are now 45,000 more federal government employees receiving a six-figure salary than there were before the pandemic. By the way, no federal bureaucrat took a pay cut during the pandemic. And according to our friends at secondstreet.org, the federal government has zero records of its employees ever taking a pay cut. So pay raises, no pay cuts for government employees. And here's the cherry on top, the big golden cherry on top, I should say, is that the federal government also dished out $360 million in bonuses in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, there's been a lot of hard work going on there, and it isn't coming from PSAC. It's coming from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in Ottawa. I must say, I was hosting at CFRA Radio years ago, and I remember when the Phoenix pay system was crashing and burning. We were getting phone calls from people who work for the government who were pleading for help, who hadn't been paid or had been way overpaid, and they were terrified, all this sort of stuff where, they couldn't pay rent or mortgage because the very software through the federal government, which was paying them, wasn't working. We reached out to union leaders at PSAC. Not a word, man. Not a word for months. They were not, front lines defending their workers, blah, blah, blah. But they sure as heck will be there when it comes to pay raises and bonuses while the rest of us are enduring hardship. Exactly. So you mentioned that it was bonuses on top of pay raise. Not to rub salt in the wound, but I think we need to know the numbers here. Can you break down what kind of bonuses we're talking about when it comes to government employees?
$171 million in bonuses in 2020, $190 million in bonuses in 2021. Remember, these are federal government employees, federal government bureaucrats. This isn't like, the nurses who are staffing the front lines in Alberta Health Services, just for example. No, these are federal bureaucrats when we're talking about these bonuses. Now, 90% of the federal government executives received a bonus last year, even though federal departments failed to meet half of their own performance objectives. Simmer, look, Todd, our boss, if we don't meet 50% of our dashboard performance objectives, we don't get a bonus. We get shown the door, okay? Yeah. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because you have the federal government with its tentacles everywhere, like this big old octopus. You have federal crown corporations that have also been running around giving themselves bonuses. The Bank of Canada failed to do its only job, its one job, to keep inflation low. What did it do? Handed out $45 million in bonuses and pay raises during the pandemic. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, another crown core that is no stranger to the taxpayer cookie jar, handed out nearly $60 million in bonuses and pay raises during the pandemic and when Canadians can afford to buy a home. Destination Canada. This might be the most craziest, ladies and gentlemen, but this is another crown corporation. Its task is to promote Canadian tourism. Now, while its tourism industry was shut down, when people were legally not allowed to come to Canada, what did they do? Well, they also handed out pay raises and bonuses. The CBC, our favorite little state broadcaster, also handed out $51 million in bonuses and pay raises in 2020 and 2021. CBC, $51 million in bonuses and pay raises during the pandemic. And also, let's look at the job situation here, right? You mentioned the tale of two pandemics. Well, I got some stats and figures for you. Last December, our finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, she essentially claimed during the fall fiscal update that, well, Canada recovered all of the lost jobs during the pandemic. Well, I looked at the numbers. While she was making that claim, there were 80,000 fewer jobs in the private sector. There were 312,000 more government jobs across Canada. Of those new government jobs, there were 114,000 more public administration bureaucrat jobs. So while the finance minister was claiming that we recovered all the lost jobs last year, in fact, it was the private sector taking it on the chin, while the golden gates of government got even more gold.
It really is gross, and it is the tale of two pandemics. You were mentioning the fact that, the desk warmers and the bureaucrats responsible for promoting tourism in Canada actually managed to, eke out a bonus. Well, the folks on the front lines of the tourism industry were just getting sacked. It brings up a story. I was speaking with a young guy. He was from Alberta, working his butt off out in Vancouver, and he actually worked as a bellhop for many years at the hotel. Hadn't heard that term in a while, and putting himself through school, whatnot, working really hard. He got completely canned because, of course, nobody was allowed to travel or come to Canada. And he was actually trying to save the PST that the provincial government was punishing him with for daring to get a used car to try to buy Uber, to try to drive Uber so he could pay his rent. Like, it's just this cascade of unfairness and the tale of two pandemics. So this affects real people. This is not just numbers. This is not just us versus them. This is the tale of two pandemics. We're paying for it here. So we've got hundreds of thousands of government employees. They're getting a raise. Hundreds of millions of dollars paid out in bonuses. Now the government union bosses actually are pushing for up to 14% raises in their wages. So folks, who needs to pay that, right?
Yep. Total compensation up to 14%. And you know what? What really grinds my gears, Chris, and maybe we can just close on this. Not only are the people who didn't financially suffer at all during the pandemic even financially benefited, not only are they grabbing for more, but if taxpayers don't pony up, they're threatening not to show up to work.
This is completely unacceptable, folks. If you're mad, good. Do something with that anger that is useful. Email and phone your member of parliament. Doesn't matter which party they're representing, because they work for you. You tell them to tell PSAC to back down, that you will not be forking over 14% pay raises and that you won't be putting up with this anymore. And if your MP doesn't respond to you, here's a little tip. Send them a follow-up email and you tell them at the next election that you're going to organize a group in your neighborhood and you're going to door knock against them in their riding. You're going to get a response from that, because then their job's on the line. Folks, if you want any of these details and stats, Franco put all of it into an excellent column in The Sun. Check out our show notes for the link to that.